You know, some stories, they just sound completely impossible. And this is one of them. Today, we're diving into one of the wildest, most audacious military campaigns in all of history, Hannibal Barca's legendary march across the Alps. It's an incredible story of revenge, of pure genius, and a brutal, brutal war against nature itself. So, to really get what Hannibal pulled off, you have to get inside the Roman head for a second. For them, the Alps weren't just a bunch of big mountains. No, they were a divine barrier, a wall literally built by the gods to make Italy untouchable from the north. The very idea of marching an army, let alone an army with horses and war elephants, over those peaks wasn't just hard. To them, it was almost like spitting in the face of the gods. It was unthinkable. Yeah, but there was one guy who didn't see it that way. In 218 BC, Hannibal Barca looked at that impossible wall, and he didn't see an obstacle. He saw a back door. He decided he was going to take the war straight to Rome's doorstep by doing the one thing nobody, not his friends, and definitely not his enemies, thought could ever be done. But why? Why go through all that trouble? I mean, why not just sail an army across the sea? Well, the answer starts in Spain, and it all comes down to family and a promise of revenge. See, Hannibal's family, the Barca clan, had been absolutely crushed by Rome in an earlier war, and they were starving for payback. So after getting crushed, did the Barcas just pack it in? No way. They rebuilt. Over in Spain, they basically carved out their own personal kingdom, which they called New Carthage. And this wasn't just some little outpost. It was a powerhouse, fueled by Spanish silver mines and local warriors. Every single bit of it was designed for one thing and one thing only, getting strong enough to take another shot at Rome. So check this out. The whole thing was deliberate. The Barcas build their power base, and then Hannibal, at the super young age of 26, takes over. What's the first thing he does? He pokes the bear. He attacks a city called Saguntum, which was a Roman ally. Rome flips out and tells Carthage to hand Hannibal over or else. Well, Carthage chose or else, thinking, the war would be fought on their home turf in Africa. They had absolutely no clue what was about to hit them. Now, let's just try to wrap our heads around the sheer size of this force Hannibal put together. First up, the infantry. 50,000 men. I mean, think about that. That's not an army. That's a whole city on the move. Imagine the logistics of just feeding that many people as they march through hostile territory. It's mind-boggling. Then you add 9,000 cavalry. And we're not talking about just any old riders here. This included the famous Numidian light cavalry, who were basically the special forces of the ancient world. This was his eyes and ears, his flanking force, a fast, deadly unit that the rigid Roman legions just couldn't handle. They were like ghosts on the battlefield. And then, of course, you've got the X factor, the shock troops. 37 war elephants, the tanks of the ancient world. These things were terrifying psychological weapons built to just crash through enemy lines. But just think about it for a second. How in the world do you feed these things? How do you get a 3-ton animal across a river, let alone over a mountain? This alone tells you Hannibal was playing a completely different game from everyone else. So you'd think the mountains were the first real test, right? Nope. Turns out it was a river. The army gets to the Rhône River, and on the other side, there's a huge army of local Gauls just waiting for them, daring them to cross. This was the first big challenge of this insane journey. And right here, you see the genius of Hannibal in action. He doesn't just try to brute force his way across. Instead, he sends a small group on a secret march, way upriver, under the cover of darkness. The next day, the main army starts making a huge racket pretending they're about to cross. As the Gauls focus on them, that hidden force comes crashing into their rear. Complete chaos, absolute panic. And while the Gauls are totally disoriented, the main army just waltzes across. A beautiful, perfectly executed plan. Okay, so the soldiers are across, but what about the elephants, right? These giant animals were petrified of the deep water. So Hannibal's engineers build these huge rafts, cover them with dirt and grass so they look like solid land, and basically trick the elephants into walking onto them. Of course, some of them still freaked out and fell in, but get this, the ones that fell in, they survived. They literally used their trunks as snorkels, breathing through them while they walked along the riverbed. Can you imagine seeing that? Incredible. All right, so the river's crossed. But now the real nightmare begins. The army is staring up at the Alps. And up here, the enemy wasn't some army you could fight with a sword. The enemy was the mountain. The cold, the ice, the thin air, the very rock under their feet was trying to kill them.
Man, that climb was just a living hell. Hostile mountain tribes were constantly attacking, rolling massive boulders down on them, sending men, horses, everything just screaming down into nothingness. The weather turned nasty. A surprise snowstorm hit, covering the paths with slick ice. Men who weren't dressed for it were literally freezing to death in their sleep. And the poor elephants, they were a world away from their warm homes, just shivering and starving.
And then they hit a wall. Literally. A massive rockfall had completely blocked the path. This could have been it. Game over. But this is where Hannibal's genius shines again, not just as a general, but as an engineer. He has his men build gigantic fires right up against the rock face. When the stone is glowing red hot, he has them throw their rations of sour wine on it. The sudden temperature drop, the thermal shock, shatters the rock. It's this incredible, almost mythical moment of ancient engineering using science and sheer will to break a mountain.
15 days. 15 days of pure hell. But they did it. They finally stumbled down from the peaks and saw the plains of Italy spread out before them. They had broken through the impassable wall. But when they looked at their own ranks, the cost was just devastating. Just look at these numbers. Seriously, let them sink in. Hannibal left Spain with something like 60,000 men. He arrived in Italy with around 26,000. Over half his army lost. Not to a single Roman soldier, but to the ice, the rocks, the cold. The mountain had claimed them. The army that came down into Italy was a ghost of its former self.
Meanwhile, back in Rome, when the first whispers of this started coming in, they probably laughed. It was completely impossible. It had to be a rumor. Remember, the Roman Senate was busy planning its own invasion of Africa. They were sure the war would be fought over there. Now their worst nightmare was suddenly in their own backyard. The Roman commander, a guy named Scipio, he hears this and thinks, perfect. He marches his legions north, fully expecting to go mop up some half-dead, frostbitten survivors and be a hero. He thought he was walking into an easy victory. He had no idea what he was really marching into.
He was expecting to find a broken, defeated army. But what was actually waiting for him on those Italian plains? See, what Scipio just didn't get was that the Alps weren't a trap that weakened Hannibal's army. They were a filter. All the weak, the unlucky, the undisciplined, they were gone. The men who made it through that nightmare, they weren't broken. They were forged. This wasn't a rabble. This was a razor-sharp weapon made of the toughest soldiers on earth, who were now fiercely loyal to the man who had led them through hell itself. Yeah, Hannibal's army was smaller now, a lot smaller, but it was also a lethal spear point aimed right at the throat of Rome. This ghost army had arrived, and the stage was set for some of the most famous battles in history. The Romans were about to find out that their nightmare had only just begun.